It's a spiritual if you turn a blind eye,
It's the dog I like. It's the one I brought him specially to give the sort of barks of encouragement. I hope you can all hear me. Yes? What? Speak up a little bit. Right. I'll do my best. I better introduce myself for the benefit of the lots of people who've forgotten who I am from last time, which is probably just as well. My name is Philip Foster. I've been involved in looking into the climate change palaver and environmentalism that tends to go with it for about 20 years now. My background is that I have degrees in natural science and also in theology. I taught for 6 years chemistry and physics, so I sort of hope I am reasonably qualified in what I say from a scientific perspective. So I just sort of share that, and have been a clergyman in the Church of England until I retired. For my sins, as I tend to say, which must have been considerable, in view of the state of the Church of England in general, though not in particular. There are differences. Okay, well, I was asked to talk about the cost of climate change and environmentalism, which, of course, tend to go together. The reason I have put this week's Spectator cover, because I thought it was totally appropriate. That, of course, is Ed Miliband's new great policy on Great British Energy and how we're all going to be carbon-free by 2030. And there's a wonderful article inside by a friend of mine called Ross Clark, and I've taken the probably illegal process of duplicating it, and there are copies of it on my stand over there, which you can take with you, because it more or less says all that needs to be said, but I'm still going to say it nonetheless. Our years are turned upside down. Our summers are no summers. Our harvests are no harvests. Well, we heard that this morning, but actually that was John King, who was an Elizabethan preacher of 1595. Or, dear Dr. Samuel Johnson, is not strange weather? Winter absorbed into spring, and now autumn comes before we have had summer. But let not our kindness for each other imitate the inconsistency of the seasons. Bless him. I thought it was very well put. But it just illustrates that climate change is absolutely nothing new. It's been going on long, long before you and I were born, long, long before Samuel Johnson was born, indeed long, long before the Egyptians were around. It's been going on all the time. It's part and parcel of this planet that we live on. And being a minister and also a Christian, I'd like to, just a verse from Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. And from another psalm, great are the works of the Lord. They are pondered by all who delight in them. Glorious and majestic are his deeds, and his righteousness endures forever. The psalmist understood far more, it seems to me, than some modern environmentalists. I just want to say, if we can move on to the next magic slide. Here it comes. A gentleman who you probably have not met. His name was Svante Arrhenius. He was a Swede, and he died in 1927. So hands up anybody who was around that. No, they weren't. The reason I put his photograph up, I'm wondering whether this thing is a bit thumpy. Anyway, never mind. Is that everything that has been built about climate change comes from that man. In about 1900, he published a calculation of what the effect of carbon dioxide was in our Earth's atmosphere. And his calculation concluded that it raised the temperature of the planet by about 30 degrees above what it would be calculated to be without it. He also made some calculations about what would happen if we doubled the amount of CO2, which might increase temperature from anything from 1 degree to 6 degrees. He wasn't sure. Well, it was a sort of calculation that people said, well, how interesting, what did you have for lunch? In other words, it wasn't really very interesting. It was purely of academic interest. Nobody could test it because you can't take the CO2 out of Earth's atmosphere and see if it makes any difference. Until 1972, which brings me to my next slide. Now, that, I'm afraid, is just a graph, as you can see. It's a graph of temperature of the surface of the moon, which was planted there, let's see what happens. In about 1972, I think it was the last Apollo 17, and it measured the surface temperature of the moon day and night. It's not very interesting because obviously it goes up and it goes down, it goes up and goes down, and the moon is a rather dull place when it comes to the day and night, except it's hot in the day and cold in the night. But, and here was the interesting part, there was an oddity. If you used Arrhenius's calculation, the moon's surface temperature should have been lower at night and a little lower in the daytime, but it wasn't. There was actually a 30-degree difference. What was Arrhenius's calculation? That CO2 makes a 30-degree difference to the planet, our atmospheric temperature. Well, that's the same on the moon. Is there any atmosphere on the moon? No. Is there any carbon dioxide on the moon? No. So Arrhenius's calculation, stress calculation, was wrong. Just wrong. End of story. Yet the whole bandwagon of, quote, climate change caused, quote, by carbon dioxide is based on that. I could give you 25 other reasons why it's wrong, but that's an interesting one that some people are not aware of. It is based on a fundamental error. NASA published this rather quietly because NASA is all in for climate change. So that's the first point I want to make. The reason that Arrhenius was wrong is actually a fairly simple one, namely that heat reaching the surface of any planet, be it Moon or Earth, doesn't just stay on the surface, it conducts below the surface, warming below the surface. So when night comes and heat leaves, the heat from below the surface rises to the surface and keeps the temperature warmer. Very simple, but they hadn't thought of that at the time. Okay, so first of all, let's dismiss the idea that there is such a thing as human-caused climate change due to emissions of carbon dioxide. CO2 has nothing to do with warming at all, or so little as to be of no point. We are not going to boil, you'll be pleased to hear. The climate will continue to change naturally, as it has always done. Human emissions are nothing to worry about. Incidentally, when CO2 levels are measured to increase on the planet, also, and somewhat in step, another gas also increases, methane. A lot less of it, you'll be pleased to hear. The two go up and down together. Now, they get all worried about this and they want us to kill all the cows, who emit a lot of methane, supposedly. They don't actually, any more than anything else. But in fact, if it is due to human emissions causing the increase in CO2, does that mean that burning fossil fuels increases flatulence? Clearly not. Secondly, and connected obviously with this, that the two going together is actually a signature of ordinary biological decay. That's what happens when a plant or an animal or anything else decays. The gases that are given off are partly carbon dioxide and some methane. That's a normal thing. So again, that's natural. CO2 is not a pollutant. I cannot stress that enough. You might suspect from the BBC that it was. It is not a pollutant. It is the life-giving gas for all life that there is. You and I are made of it. We've got a few other bits as well, some water here, some calcium, and so on and so forth. But we are made of carbon dioxide. The BBC don't seem to understand this. I notice a laugh. I wonder why. I was watching one, I think it's the programme they call Beech Wood. No, Beech Grove, I beg its pardon. It's a kind of gardener's world of sorts. And I watched it by mistake in November. And it was a very careful programme explaining the process of photosynthesis to the ignorant viewers. And the man explained how sunlight falls on the leaves of the trees, and in it chlorophyll makes sugars which makes the tree grow. End of explanation. And I thought, excuse me, I think there's something missing. Doesn't carbon dioxide come into this? Without which none of it would happen. He did it twice in the same programme, very carefully omitting the positive point about carbon dioxide. And I think this was deliberate. I think he'd been told, you will not talk about carbon dioxide as something positive. But there we go. However, so as the CO2 is regarded by the BBC, obviously, as the devil's gas. By the way, when we burn coal, which we still do a tiny bit in this country, we are burning organic fuel. All the trees that went down to make coal some 400 or 500 million years ago became coal partly because, at that point, funguses had not been invented. Fungus, as you know, will attack lignin in trees and cause them nowadays to decay and become part of the soil. But that long time ago, they didn't exist. So the tree trunks were pushed into the earth, compressed, etc., 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 and became the coal that we now burn. The same, to some degree, is true of oil and gas. So when you drive along in your car, you can say, I am burning organic fuel, because that's where it came from. It came from organisms, trees, or whatever. And the thing we are doing, by so doing, is returning dead carbon into the biosystem. Because by releasing it as carbon dioxide, it goes into the system, becomes plants, trees, and so on. It's not surprising that road verges are very often prolific places for plants. Why? Because of all the cars that pass by emitting CO2, which they love. As I believe any farmer will tell you, pumping a little CO2 into a polytunnel will increase your growth considerably. In fact, there is so little carbon dioxide currently in the atmosphere that many plants struggle for breath. They haven't got enough. And in passing, and I say this cautiously, but it is true, the discovery of what we call oil and gas in the mid-1850s actually was what saved the whales. Think about it. They didn't set out to save the whales, but because whales no longer needed to be killed for whale oil, which is what they were almost being exterminated for getting, the arrival of cheap fossil fuel made a huge difference. And as a result, there are still plenty of whales, as far as I could tell. Not that I've been out to count them. But be careful, therefore, if people say, save money, give money to the whales. They're probably all right. I may be wrong. But there you go. Now, in connection with this, and thinking about our environment, indeed we had an excellent talk from a farmer who knows far more about this than I do, but I'm just going to float this out. It was in the past that farmers, and dare I say it, estate gamekeepers, certainly in the UK, who were the true environmentalists. Why? Firstly, because they knew what they wanted from the land. They wanted crops if you were a farmer, they wanted game and game birds, and whatever it is if you were a gamekeeper. So they took steps, naturally, to protect these things from pests. And so they would try and eliminate birds of prey, foxes, and so on. And now, through environmentalism and sites of special scientific interest and all this kind of caper, the opposite happens. Birds of prey are protected. What about their prey? They're not protected. Do you remember some years ago, or at least I remember some years ago, when somebody said, well, what's happened to all the sparrows? And somebody has pointed out, well, there are an awful lot of sparrowhawks around, which we're not allowed to get rid of. So not surprisingly, the sparrows were being picked up by the sparrowhawks. One could go and get even more controversial and talk about badgers. Fine, they're nice creatures. But they do, probably, proliferate bovine TB. They also kill hedgehogs and bumblebees. Who do you protect? Cows, bumblebees and hedgehogs, or the badgers? Maybe there's a balance to be found. But there you go. These things are never as simple as they seem. In Africa, one of the biggest pests for farmers, and biggest in every sense, is the elephant, who tramples across farmland, destroying crops and destroying trees such as there are, and it becomes very, very difficult. So unsurprisingly, they quite like to see elephants culled. I think it was a German minister for something or other who complained to Botswana about trophy hunting there, which actually is a very useful earner. The minister in Botswana replied by saying he would happily send 20,000 elephants to Germany and see what they would do with them. We heard no more. It's dreadful to say that environmentalism and the climate change that all goes part of it has been very, very costly, not just for us, but for the developing world. They already had to pay a terrible price when DDT was effectively banned. You may remember a book called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, who was, for the most part, responsible for the banning of DDT. She claimed that DDT killed birds, and birds' eggs rather, and had given her cancer. Well, that's as maybe. But the result was that DDT was banned in most third world countries as they were then. DDT was a very effective way of dealing at the time with malarial mosquito. As a result, malaria was nearly wiped out, and then they stopped using it. As a result, malaria burgeoned, and there have been an estimated 40 million deaths as a consequence of one book, Silent Spring. Is that good use of the environment? No. It's expensive, to put it mildly. Now eco-imperialists, perhaps I should call them eco-imperialists, are forcing African countries, or trying to force them, not to use their natural resources of fossil fuels, but to use expensive and unreliable solar and wind. Coming back to Britain, where we ourselves are facing our own costs, the dreadful cost of net zero. We can no longer, as you may be aware, as a result of trying to get to net zero, make our own steel. All the steel plants have been decommissioned, and the man who bought them up for that very purpose got paid twice. A, getting them cheap, and B, them being paid for closing them down. We can only make steel using arc furnaces, which are electric, but that can only use scrap iron. So what happens, God forbid, that we are faced with an actual face-to-face war? Where is the steel for our tanks and our guns going to come from? We haven't got the facility. Oh, we'll import it from China. Well, it might be China we were fighting. Oh dear. They might not want to give it to us. I mean, that's an example of on the grand scale. And as we know, the way of so-called heading for net zero, closing all our coal-fired power stations, as I think Drax is the last, there may be one other, and that's burning wood chips, imported from Canada and America, of course, at vast expense and a huge amount of fossil fuels just to bring it here. It's absurd. Whereas there is coal under our feet. Now, I'm not saying it's a nice thing to do it, and I'm not saying the miners were paid properly for getting it, but it still could be used if people were properly paid. And so we're left instead with wind and solar, and to a lesser degree, because they're slow at actually getting on with it, building small nuclear plants, which could be done. But wind and solar are what we're relying on. Now, I'm sure most of you are aware of a very useful website when it comes to these things, Paul Homewood's website called Not a Lot of People Know That. Remember Michael Caine? Not a lot of people know that. And if you Google that, he will have a more or less daily presentation of news relevant to the question of costs and lunacies. Mr. What's his name? Mr. Miliband, I beg his pardon. Brilliant ideas about how we're going to get to net zero in the next 10 minutes. And there is, the wind farms that are now being built, again, at colossal profit for the people building them, are unlikely anyway to be connected for at least 10 years because of the need to provide cabling, pylons and so on right out to these remote places, which they hadn't thought about when they started, as usual. Meanwhile, of course, they're paid large amounts of money for not generating electricity. The Orkneys was a case in point, 2.4 million for not producing electricity over the last few months. It was producing electricity, but they didn't need it, so they were told to turn it off and then paid compensation for not generating it. I did wonder about whether if I built a wind turbine or didn't build a wind turbine in my garden and then wrote to the energy people and said, could I have payment for A, for not having built it, and B, for not producing any electricity, how much they'd give me. But I didn't get an answer, strangely. In connection with all this net zero, moving on to electric cars, I have a leaflet on it where I analyse the metrics, as it were, of a Tesla, but the same applies to most of the others. It's most extraordinary that the government is forcing garage forecourts to sell EVs, and if they don't, they are fined £15,000 for every one they are failing to sell. Unsurprisingly, when they try and sell them, most people, not all, but most people don't want to buy them. And for good reason, in my view. Vauxhall, for example, are now discounting their electric vehicles by £10,000 and selling them at a loss on the basis, well, at least it's cheaper than paying the £15,000 fine. I still wonder if they'll sell them. A point that needs to be borne in mind, and they don't think about, is an electric vehicle uses double the amount of primary energy that an ICE car does, an ordinary internal combustion engine car. They will talk about the efficiency of the battery to motor, which probably is pretty good, it should be. But of course they forget to tell you that it costs a lot to put energy into the battery. And a crude way of looking at it is that it would take 40 kilograms of coal on a coal-fired generating plant to charge once a Tesla to go 200 miles, 40 kilograms of coal. That's the amount of electricity needed. It so happens that even a petrol car only uses 25 kilograms or 20 kilograms of fossil fuel for the same distance. And oddly, but intriguingly, in the 1930s, a British express train, if you scale it down for 2 tons Tesla and 200 miles, consumed just 16 kilograms of coal. So in other words, a Tesla is 3 to 4 times less efficient than a steam engine in the 1920s, which is pretty depressing. The other exciting thing about electric vehicles is the slight danger of fire. Can we have the next slide, please? Here we go. A lovely fire. This took place at the Luton Airport car park. The whole of the car park caught fire with about 1,000 to 1,500 cars in it, all of which were destroyed. In fact, you can have the next slide too, which I think shows that. So, there we are. There's a little sample of the ruin. Now, you wouldn't have learnt this from the BBC. They announced it was because a diesel van had caught fire. And the moment I heard that, I thought, oh, really? Tell me how you set fire to a diesel van. I would ask them to go out and try. It's almost impossible. Diesel does not burn, or at least not that easily. Even with a blow lamp, I think you'd have grave difficulties getting a diesel van to catch fire. They said no more about it, except talked about all the other parts. But in fact, it turned out, with investigation, that it was indeed a diesel vehicle. It was a diesel Range Rover, a hybrid. And it was the hybrid battery that had caught fire. And once it had caught fire, as you could see, nothing can stop it. You can't put them out that easily. In fact, they're almost impossible to put out. I'm sure the fire brigade have some form of ways of dealing with this. But the best technique in America, I gather, is to throw them into the chap's swimming pool. And even that doesn't put them out, because then the battery reacts with the water. Because it's got lithium in it, those of you who remember your chemistry, lithium metal plus water produces hydrogen, which of course is very exciting when it catches fire. So they go on burning for days, and they're very difficult to deal with. So you've also got that huge disadvantage, and they're happening all over the place. Every now and again you'll sort of see a photograph of some sad fire in a personal house in the garage, and the house probably burnt as well. Almost certainly an electric vehicle in the garage. Even if it's not charging, doesn't always follow that it won't catch fire. So, I mean, there is that lethal hazard. I'm told from the fire brigade in London that, for example, they have one e-scooter fire every 2 days. That's only, I know, those little things that people knock you off the pavement with. I mean, they're great fun, I'm sure. But obviously, people tend to take them into their houses and plug them in to charge them. And the result is often disastrous and fatal. There have been several cases of people being burnt alive as a result, because once again, they're difficult to put out. Not good stuff. So not only are we faced with being almost forced to buy electric cars, it's interesting that Ford are giving up, Volvo are giving up, and probably quite a number of others are quietly giving up making them, because they know they don't sell. They're very expensive to produce. Most of the products come from China, of course. Lithium and so on is almost entirely a Chinese monopoly. So I suspect, I pray, that shortly and fairly soon, the whole idea of electric vehicles will be quietly laid to one side. Sorry if you've got one. And sadly, there's no second-hand value. And I say that seriously, because A, they are uninsurable. No insurance company will take you on because they don't know the state of your battery. They won't insure. And even, I gather, a Tesla insurance is somewhere around £4,000 to £5,000 a year. Not nice. The trouble is, what will happen, of course, is that the rest of us will all have to subsidise that so that their price can come down and our car insurance will go up accordingly. But I'll leave that to one side. It hasn't quite happened yet. And then, of course, when it comes to ordinary heating, a minor problem of how warm we can be in winter. Gas boilers are now more or less verboten. You have to have a heat pump or something else, or just go electric. Let alone the fact that a gas boiler and oil are perhaps by far the best and most efficient form of heating for a house. It's very contained, it's very flexible, it's very timeable, and so on. Most of us, I suspect, have gas boilers and are very grateful for them and are very sad when they go wrong. Keep servicing them, because if they go wrong, fatally, then you may be faced with the awful choice of saying, sorry, no gas boilers. We're just going to have to give you a heat pump, which will cost you 5 times as much and won't work. An interesting case from an ecclesiastical point of view. There's a church in Derbyshire, St. John the Baptist Tideswell, which I gather, though I've not seen it, is a very beautiful country church. And their gas boiler, I think, got flooded and had to be replaced. So they applied to the diocese in the usual way for permission to do it, and it was refused on the basis of net zero. They can't use a heat pump because the graveyard is not a very good place to put a heat exchanger. The corpses might rise up and get cross. I wouldn't blame them either. So literally, they froze last winter because they had no means of heating. and the church fabric is beginning to suffer from damp and all the other things, and they still can't get permission to replace their ordinary heating system with a gas boiler, courtesy the Diocese of Derby. I just hope common sense will finally get to there. And anyway, the whole idea of converting electricity back into heat in a general way is not a very bright idea. It's expensive to turn heat into electricity. It's a bit silly then to throw it all away and turn it back into heat. That's not very efficient. Yes, there are places where you need it, I know, electric oven or whatever it may be, but the principle of turning electricity back into heat in a huge extent is just plain silly when you've got easier ways of doing it. This is a bit of a scattergun approach here. Also, back to, when we think of Millie Bean's little effort at asking, I can't remember who it was, how on earth are we going to get to net zero by 2030, to which I think they probably replied, it was your good idea, you silly fellow. Now tell us what you want us to do. Those who've looked at it say it's simply not possible, and that anyway, the way things are going, we're going to face major blackouts by 2028, and I suspect that's a conservative estimate. By cancelling our North Sea oil drilling, once again, we're deliberately forcing up the price of fuel anyway. Now, they always moan and groan, oh, well, if we still have to sell it at the international price. Why? It's our gas. We can do as we like with it. We can give it away if we like. We don't have to go on the international market with it. We can fuel our own people and keep us all warm. Wouldn't that be a nice idea? But no, we cancel that. So one thing I do recommend, practically speaking, as far as the cost of all this, and it is cost, I'm afraid, it's worth thinking about getting a generator, if you can. I mean, it all depends where you live and your circumstances. But you can buy a 3 kilowatt generator for around £600. And these can be life-saving in some ways because one of the things people forget is that a gas boiler system needs electricity. So if the power goes, you can't start your boiler. You can't turn on your, well, you can turn on your gas if you've got a gas ring. So I would certainly, if it's possible, think about even sharing one with a neighbour to have a generator available in the garage. Always run it with the door open, not closed. It's quite easy to plug them in if you're reasonably attuned electrically. You don't need a sophisticated switchover system. All you need to do is to turn off your house at the main switch so you're isolated from the grid. Then you just plug the generator into a socket in your garage. That will go through your fuse box and illuminate all your lights, your fridges, and so on will all run quite satisfactorily. I've done it, so I know it works. So I do recommend thinking about it. I appreciate it's a cost, but we may well be needing it in the not so short time either. So going back to environmentalism, which I've touched on, which is all sort of connected, the problem today is that most modern environmentalists don't know what they want. Whereas the farmer and the estate agent, all the rest of it, knew what they wanted to do with their land, to grow crops, keep cattle, whatever it may be, the environmentalist doesn't know what he wants. And I mustn't make a flippant joke, so I won't, about the infamous definition of the Irishman who doesn't know what he wants and will not be satisfied until he gets it. Sorry. And that's very unkind to any Irishman here. I apologise with cringes, because it's not true of them. It's much more true of other people. So we've got this problem, and it's sort of overwhelming. I mean, our farmer friend talked about these sites of special scientific interest, which suddenly spring up apparently anywhere because some newt or some mushroom or something is considered of enormous importance. Well, maybe they are in their way, but there are other things to think about. So, having talked about the fact that today environmentalism preserves all the wrong things, it seems to be, they seem to think, and there's a lot talked about this, wilding. Rewilding, this is the great thing. I don't know how many of those sort of municipal car parks and roundabouts you've seen that look like weed beds. The answer is they've been rewilding them, and they look hideous. Because A, it saves money, they don't have to pay a gardener, they just let it grow wild, which is the excuse. But it also highlights something that, again, it seems environmentalists don't seem to understand, namely that if you leave something to be wilderness, which is what they seem to want, wilderness is change. Day by day, month by month, year by year. Wilderness doesn't say where you leave it anymore. Somebody said when you put a child in a room and lock it up, it doesn't stay the same age. Wilderness is develop, grow, and so on. Fine. But they don't seem to be aware of it. They still believe, it seems to me, in what was used to be called the balance of nature, which was a sort of firm principle in the understanding of the natural world. It's actually an idea from Greek philosophy. There's no actual evidence for it, but it seems a nice idea. There is still no evidence for the balance of nature. Nature doesn't work like that. The natural world of plants and animals, rather than existing in a nice steady state, actually behave like a boom and bust economy. Explosions of certain populations followed often by explosions in a predator population, and vice versa. Sometimes animals explode even into extinction. Sometimes they just fade away. Something is balanced or in equilibrium, it's probably dead. Extinctions are part of the way the natural world works, and no one knows how many species there are. Anyone like to hazard a guess? The answer is anything between 8 million and 80 million. Nobody knows how many different species there are on the planet. Nobody's counted them. And anyway, so how do you know if something that you didn't know was there has gone? But a lot of them will tell you so. And how do you know if some tiny beetle has actually become extinct or simply moved house? We can ignore scare stories about extinctions anyway. I sometimes fear that the only thing in danger of extinction is reason. Anyway, we are to some degree part of nature, and that's sometimes what the environmentalists say. But if we are part of nature, then what we do to nature is natural. The beaver makes dams and causes floods and all kinds of difficulties for other people. That's the beaver's thing, they do that. Termites, they build huge cities out of old trees. Their global population mass likely exceeds that of the mass of humans, you'd be pleased to know. So perhaps we should have a war on termites. They produce a lot of methane, by the way. But if we're part of nature, therefore it doesn't matter what we do. Well, I don't go along with that entirely, but that's partly because most modern environmentalists, not all, are materialists. And that they take that view. But if so, they can't have their cake and eat it. However, there is a more ancient view, and forgive me as a clergyman for bringing it up, but I think it's actually much more relevant, where it says in Genesis, God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Mark that, by the way. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Note the words, rule, subdue. It was God's calling to man to make something of the earth, not just to leave it in a wild condition. Now, of course, ruling can be done well or it can be done badly. And perhaps there are times indeed when humanity has done things rather badly. But either way, that is our situation. That's who we are, whether we like it or not. Incidentally, and in passing, you'll notice that God doesn't say anything about the weather or the climate. Man has no control over that. That's God's domain. Okay, that sounds old-fashioned. But curiously, there is every evidence to suggest that humanity has little or no control whatever over shifts in climate, that most of it comes from out there, from the galaxy. Complicated, I'm not going to go into it in detail. If you desperately want to know, read my book. It's not my theory anyway. So we've got this problem with our environmentalists who are causing all kinds of difficulties for people trying to get on with their lives. So I just want to read you an extract, and I think I'll draw to a close fairly rapidly after this, of the fate of Yellowstone Park, which is perhaps the most long-lasting and classic example of environmentalism gone terribly, terribly wrong. Right, I quote, "Yellowstone Park was the first wilderness to be set aside as a natural preserve anywhere in the world. The region around the Yellowstone River in Wyoming had long been recognized for its wondrous scenic beauty. Railroads wanted scenic attractions to draw people west, so in 1872, in part because of railroad pressure, President Ulysses Grant set aside 2 million acres and created Yellowstone National Park. There was only one problem, unacknowledged then and later. No one had any experience trying to preserve wilderness. There had never been any need to do it before. It was assumed to be much easier than it proved to be. When Theodore Roosevelt visited the park in 1903, he saw a landscape teeming with game. There were thousands of elk, buffalo, black bear, deer, mountain lions, grizzlies, coyotes, wolves, and bighorn sheep. By that time, there were rules in place to keep things as they were. Soon after that, the Park Service was formed, a new bureaucracy whose sole job was to maintain the park in its original condition. Yet within 10 years, the teeming landscape that Roosevelt saw was gone forever. The reason for this were the park managers, charged with keeping the park in pristine condition, had taken a series of steps that they thought were best interests of preserving the park and its animals, but they were wrong. The early park managers mistakenly believed that elk were about to become extinct, so they tried to increase the elk herds within the park by eliminating predators. To that end, they shot and poisoned all the wolves in the park. They prohibited Indians from hunting in the park, though Yellowstone was a traditional hunting ground. Protected, the elk herds exploded and ate so much of certain trees and grasses that the ecology of the area began to change. They ate the trees that the beavers used to make dams, so the beavers vanished. That was when the managers discovered beavers were vital to the overall water management of the region. When the beavers disappeared, the meadows dried up, the trout and otter vanished, the soil erosion increased, and the park ecology changed even further. By the 1920s, it had become abundantly clear there were too many elk, so the rangers began to shoot them by the thousands. But the change in plant ecology seemed to be permanent. The old mix of trees and grasses did not return. It also became increasingly clear that the Indian hunters of old had exerted a valuable ecological influence on the parklands by keeping down the number of elk, moose, and bison. This belated recognition came as part of a more general understanding that the Native Americans had strongly shaped the untouched wilderness that the first white man saw, or thought they were seeing, when they arrived first from the New World. The untouched wilderness was nothing of the sort. Human beings of the North American continent had exerted a huge influence on the environment for thousands of years, burning plain grasses, modifying forests, thinning specific animal populations, and hunting others to extinction. In retrospect, the rules forbidding Indians from hunting was seen as a mistake, but it was just one of the many mistakes that continued to be made in an unbroken stream by park managers. Grizzlies were protected, then killed off. Wolves were killed off, then brought back. Animal research involving study in radio collars was halted, then resumed after certain species were declared endangered. A policy of fire prevention was instituted, with nobody understanding the regenerative effects of fire. When the policy was finally reversed, thousands of acres burned too hotly that the ground was sterilized, and the forests did not grow back without reseeding. Rainbow trout were introduced in the 1970s, soon killing off the native cutthroat species, and on and on and on. So there you have a history of ignorant, incompetent, and disastrously intrusive intervention, followed by attempts to repair the intervention, followed by attempts to repair the damage caused by the repairs, as dramatic as any oil spill or toxic dump. Except in this case, there was no evil corporation or fossil fuel economy to blame. This disaster was caused by environmentalists charged with protecting the wilderness, who made one dreadful mistake after another. and along the way proved how little they understood the environment they intended to protect. Well, that gives you a good flavour of what's been going on the grand scale. And that's what we're seeing in England again, the same sort of thing. Incompetence, ignorance, and often just fetish views. I want to preserve badgers. I want to preserve sparrowhawks. I want to preserve this. Nobody thinking or even integrating what they're trying to do with the consequences that we know. So all this, of course, costs money, and guess who is paying for that? You and I. I could go on, and in fact I'm going to shut up in a moment. Just to flag up that not only do I have a leaflet about Tesla, I've also got a leaflet about our waste, called a dreadful waste. Most of you are probably not aware that what you recycle is either eventually, if they're lucky, incinerated or dumped in the oceans. We used to send it to China and Tibet and places like that. The Chinese had the good sense to say, we've had enough of your rubbish, and stopped it in 1918. But what they were actually doing was sending ships out into the Pacific or around the Indian Ocean, and all the ships did was to open their hulls and drop the rubbish into the sea. Or, on occasions, land it on shore and set fire to it, just like a bonfire, which of course was a pretty nasty thing to do. Some of it we have tried to send to Denmark because they have incinerators. We have very few. And that, of course, is very costly. And all that recycling is frankly going almost for nothing. It's a waste of time, a waste of taxpayers' money, and a waste of the poor bin men who have to go around collecting all these different bins. My own view would be that, as a sensible policy, would be almost certainly to burn nearly everything we throw away. There are perfectly good ways of producing incinerators that are non-toxic, that clean out any toxins that might occur, and their only emissions are carbon dioxide and H2O, both of which are beneficial. And in passing, they generate steam, which can then be used to generate electricity. So it's a totally virtuous circle. But we haven't enough of them. And those that we do have, of course, can charge an arm and a leg, which they do. Right, so I think I'm going to stop because it's probably far too late. I have, lastly, just to say, if you feel like sticking something to your number plate, I have my sort of virtue signal. You know how the green stripes appear on all these electric cars? Well, this one is red and green, and the top part says CO2 makes, and the bottom half says Earth green, which is true.